The file begins. February 2026. Morning. The fresh concrete of London streets, not yet dried from the night's rain. Woods-Farm. Quiet. But this silence was deceptive. The police arrived with a warrant. Arrest. For the first time in modern history, royal blood stained the handcuffs. He had turned 66. It was his birthday. The interrogation lasted almost half a day. 11 hours, 12. Each question a blow. Each answer an attempt to build a collapsing wall. Charges: official misconduct, transmission of confidential data. Searches at Royal-Lodge, Woods-Farm. Immunity vanished. It dissolved into the air like morning mist over the Thames. The monarchy found itself on the edge. King Charles III, removed but resolute, took the only possible step. He granted full access to the Buckingham Palace archives. Documents pertaining to the prince's activities. Everything that had been hidden now lay on the table, under the scrutinizing gaze of the investigators. This was not a gesture of goodwill. It was a sentence passed by his own house. The arrest was no accident. It was the finale, the inevitable conclusion to a series of events unfolding in the shadows. A year prior, in April 2025, the world saw Virdziniyi Джуффре's memoir, Nobody's Girl, 3 times. That word hung in the air, a suffocating weight. Then, in January 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice unleashed a new trove of Epstein documents upon the world, a digital coffin. Amidst thousands of pages, names and dates, details emerged. Photographs. Him hunched over a woman in Epstein's mansion. The images were the final nail. They shattered any pretense of denial. The Wall Street Journal had long been investigating. Their data pointed to a different crime, the transfer of classified government documents to Epstein. Between 2001 and 2011, travel logs, Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, a confidential review of Afghanistan investments, correspondence about the Royal Bank of Scotland. This was more than just indiscreet connections. This was state secret. In October 2025, he'd already lost all his titles. But that was merely the prelude. Now the UK government was seriously discussing a bill to remove him from the line of succession. Defense Secretary Luke Pollard called it the right thing. The anatomy of the fall was complete. But the legacy of this catastrophe, as biographer Andrew Morton predicted, would echo for years. For a long time he was known otherwise. Not as a figure in a dossier, but as the third child, mother's favorite, a prince born in a moment of relative calm. His arrival in 1960 became a gift. He was the younger brother of the heir, free from the weight of the crown, yet bathed in its glow. The golden boy. His path seemed carved from granite of privilege. A naval career, the Royal Navy. He served in the Falklands War, a helicopter pilot, a hero. The public saw in him the embodiment of British valor, unwavering, brave. He returned home to the applause of a nation, his fame shining like a polished crest. Photographs of that time. Smiles, impeccable uniform, handshakes with leaders. He was a symbol, a representative of empire. His presence at international events was a guarantee of attention. He carried the flag. This was a period when his name was associated solely with duty and honor. No one could have foreseen how quickly that marble pedestal would begin to crumble. How little it takes for the gleam of gold to turn to dirt. But behind the shine of grand entrances lay another world. A world where the lines of decency blurred and the thirst for attention found its peculiar ways. His acquaintance with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell was no accident. It was the product of a meticulously crafted web, cleverly laid by hunters of influence. Maxwell, daughter of a media mogul, knew how to penetrate the upper echelons. She was the gateway. Epstein offered not just society, but entry into an exclusive club, a club where money flowed like a river, and moral compasses were broken. Prince Andrew, accustomed to unconditional admiration, found himself in an environment where he was worshipped differently, not for his title, but for access, for proximity to the crown. It was tempting. Parties, private jets, indecent luxury. The first alarms were barely audible, drowned out by the pop of champagne and laughter. Epstein's reputation was already in question then, but the prince ignored these shadows. He saw the glitter and felt himself not just a prince in this company, but a lord. This was a Paw's fatal mistake, a gamble that ultimately cost him everything. The initial alarms, once drowned by champagne, now echoed in a desolate chamber. The gamble, a fatal mistake, had finally matured into a bitter harvest. April 2025. The publication of Nobody's Girl, the memoirs of Virdzhinia Джуффре, was not merely a book, it was a detonation. A post-mortem audit of a life scarred, now laid bare for the world to see. Джуффре, long a shadow in the periphery of a monstrous narrative, stepped into the light, bringing with her the chilling details. She stated with stark, unwavering clarity that the prince had engaged with her intimately. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Each encounter a fresh stain on the royal fabric, a fresh nail in the coffin of his public life. The world had heard these allegations before, dismissed by many as whispers in the dark, or the desperate cries of a victim seeking retribution. But this time, they landed with the weight of concrete. The palace, once a fortress of decorum, found itself under siege. Denials, swift and absolute, were issued. A well-oiled machinery of legal defense whirred into action, attempting to contain the spreading contagion. They spoke of inconsistencies, of memory lapses, of opportunistic motives. Yet the images, those damning visual echoes of Epstein's world, began to resurface with renewed, terrifying clarity. The photographs, later released by the U.S. Department of Justice in January 2026, showed a figure, undeniably the prince, in a compromising posture within the gilded cage of Epstein's mansion, leaning over a woman, a silent testimony to a past he desperately sought to bury. The mud was no longer confined to the shadows. It was now splattered across the polished floors of Buckingham. The anatomy of his fall was accelerating. The resurrected claims, once again resonating through the halls of power, demanded more than mere denials. The legal noose, long dangling, began to tighten. The public, fueled by Giuffre's raw narrative and the subsequent release of the Department of Justice's documents, demanded accountability. In October 2025, the hammer fell. Prince Andrew was stripped of all remaining royal titles. No longer prince, no longer burdened by official duties, he became a ghost in his own gilded cage. Yet the lineage, the bloodline remained. He was still 8th in line to the throne, an anomaly, a lingering stain. But the storm was far from over. The focus shifted, expanding beyond the echoes of past indiscretions. The new investigation, launched in the shadows of the old scandal, pointed to a different kind of transgression. Not directly sexual, but perhaps equally corrosive. From 2001 to 2011, during his tenure as a trade representative, Andrew allegedly funneled confidential government documents to Epstein. Reports from Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong. Investment reviews from Afghanistan. Correspondence concerning the Royal Bank of Scotland. An inventory of sins painstakingly compiled. The King, Charles III, in a move of stark, unyielding resolve, granted police unfettered access to all relevant palace archives. No corner of the past would remain unexamined. February 2026, his 66th birthday. A day that should have been marked by quiet reflection was instead punctuated by the cold reality of an arrest. The first time a high-ranking royal had faced such a fate in modern history. 11 hours, 12 hours, interrogation. Questions hanging in the stale air like unseen dust motes. He was released, yes, but under the suffocating weight of continued investigation. The government, alarmed by the unprecedented crisis, began discussions on a legislative act, a bill to remove him permanently from the line of succession, a final irreversible act of banishment. The empire's fragments scattered the bitter testament of a life spent in shadows and ill-gotten luxury. The crisis, as royal biographer Andrew Morton predicted, would linger. A cold, hard fact, like concrete, motionless, cold, oppressive. And it was in this stillness, in the silence of the escalating investigation, that the contours of new, irrefutable evidence emerged. In late January 2026, mere weeks before his arrest, the United States Department of Justice published another tranche of documents in the Epstein case. This wasn't just a pile of papers. It was a digital coffin, holding details that had previously only been whispered behind closed doors. Testimony, correspondence, and one particularly venomous photograph. A snapshot where he, the prince, leaned over a woman in the mansion of a man who built his empire on the sins of others. Evasions, vague insinuations, all of it crumbled under the weight of that frame. This wasn't a direct accusation of physical violence. It was something worse. It was an anatomy of a fall, documented in the minutest detail, evidence of proximity, an inventory of sins that had previously seemed mere rumors. Every pixel, every shadow in that image screamed of connections he had so desperately tried to forget. Connections that had now become his verdict. The verdict, which began to be handed down long before his formal arrest. This was not a sudden expulsion, but a slow, painful fading. Months before his name appeared in the official arrest records in October 2025, his moral death sentence had already been signed. He lost everything. All royal titles, including the very word prince, which once defined his existence. All official duties. This was not his choice. This was a verdict handed down by the very institution of which he was a part. The monarchy, like an ancient, wounded beast, had cast off a diseased limb to save itself. Public opinion, corroded by a relentless stream of revelations, from the memoirs of Virdzininie Джуффре to the ever-emerging details of Epstein's past, demanded blood. And blood was obtained. He became an outcast, a figure whose presence cast a shadow over a 1,000-year history. The remnants of his empire, stripped of their shine and power, were scattered across the cold marble of the palace corridors. Loneliness, silence, only the echo of his own mistakes in empty rooms. This was not merely a stripping of privileges. This was exile, a public anatomy of a fall, a harbinger of what worse was yet to come. And it came. It arrived not with a deafening thunder, but with a cold knock on the doors of Woods-Farm. February 2026, his 66th birthday. Instead of celebration, handcuffs. Instead of congratulations, a search warrant. Police methodically combed through the rooms of his residences, seizing documents, digital memories. A hunt for ghosts that it seemed had long been buried. 11 hours. 12. Interrogation. Locked in a room where words carried the weight of a verdict. He, eighth in line to the throne, became the first member of the royal family in modern history to be arrested. This was not an arrest for sexual crimes. This was something more subtle, more insidious. This was an inventory of sins, a digital anatomy of a fall. He was released, but the doors of his gilded cage had slammed shut forever. October 2025. Months before this arrest, the very essence of his identity had been torn from him. The title Prince. It is not merely a word, it is a foundation. He became a man without a name, without a function, the wreckage of an empire that was once his life. Virdzhinia Джуффre's memoirs, published in April, were the final nail. Nobody's girl. 3 times. The past, like acid, corroded the present. And then, in January 2026, new documents from the U.S. Department of Justice, photographs, captured moments that no amount of royal tears could wash away. He stared into the void and saw there only his own reflection. Loneliness. It smells of old dust and unfulfilled hopes. His exile was predetermined, but now it was taking on new, even more sinister contours. The Epstein affair, like a black hole, continued to draw him in. And now the focus had shifted from personal sins to an act bordering on treason, or at least something that smelled just as foul. The transfer of confidential documents, travel reports, Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong, investments in Afghanistan, the restructuring of the Royal Bank of Scotland, all of it, according to the investigation, had flowed to Epstein between 2001 and 2011. King Charles III, like an ancient inquisitor, granted full access to the archives of Buckingham Palace. The sacrifice had been made. This was not merely a scandal. This was a verdict. Defense Minister Luke Pollard, without a trace of doubt, spoke of a bill to exclude him from the line of succession, legally. Not just to strip him of titles, but to erase him from history, from the very fabric of the monarchy. This was not a collapse. This was the anatomy of a fall, brought to its absolute conclusion. A fatal error, a fateful mistake that turned the brilliance of a dynasty into the shadow of a bunker. Epstein's legacy is not only a list of victims, it is also tarnished reputations, shattered destinies. Andrew became one of them. His story is a bitter testament to the fact that even the highest walls cannot conceal decay, and the most brilliant titles cannot wash away the dirt. This was a posthumous audit of a life, conducted during his lifetime, and it revealed emptiness. The emptiness that remains when money, power, and friends are gone, when only the cold metal of truth remains, and silence.